My name is Celeste Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and the week my father was buried, my brother transferred every dollar from the family estate into an account I didn't have access to. He did it on a Thursday, 4 days after the funeral, before the flowers on the grave had even had time to wilt. I found out the way you find out things like that, not from him, not from a lawyer, not from any of the people who were supposed to be watching, but from a bank statement that arrived at my mother's house addressed to both of us, because my father had never gotten around to updating the mailing address on the joint account he'd set up for estate management purposes. It came in a plain white envelope on a Tuesday morning, and I almost didn't open it. I wish I could tell you I knew immediately what it meant. I didn't. I had to read the line 3 times before my brain accepted what my eyes were already telling me. Zero balance. Transfer complete. Date, 4 days after we put my father in the ground. My brother's name is Conrad. He is 3 years older than me, and for most of our lives, he was the person I trusted more than almost anyone else in the world. I say that not to make this story more dramatic, but because it is the truth, and because the truth is the only thing I have left of who we used to be. Before I tell you what I did about it, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Tell me what time it is where you are. I want to know how far this one travels. My father built his business from nothing over the course of 35 years. It wasn't a glamorous business. He ran a regional logistics company, trucking routes, warehouse contracts, the unglamorous infrastructure that keeps everything else moving. He was not a man who talked about money or displayed it or used it to make himself feel important. He was a man who worked and who believed that the work itself was the point, and who had very specific ideas about what it meant to earn something versus receive it. He had 2 children, me and Conrad. He raised us both with the same expectations and the same work ethic and the same understanding that nothing in our family was given. It was built, and what was built was shared equally, and that was not a conversation, it was a fact. Conrad and I both went into the business in our 20s. I ran the operational side, routing, contracts, vendor relationships, the day-to-day machinery of keeping 37 trucks moving across 4 states. Conrad handled the financial and administrative side, accounting, payroll, investor relations, the paperwork that I never had the patience for and that he genuinely seemed to enjoy. It was a good division of labor for a long time. We were good at different things, and we trusted each other to handle what the other one couldn't see as clearly. I don't know exactly when that changed. I've thought about it many times since, and I still can't point to the specific moment. What I can tell you is that, in the last 2 years of my father's illness, Conrad started having conversations with people I didn't know about things I wasn't told about. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room before you've identified where it's coming from. Something was slightly different. Nothing I could name yet. My father was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition when I was 35. It moved faster than any of us expected. Within 8 months of the diagnosis, he had moved from mild cognitive difficulty to something significantly more serious. And within another 6 months, he was no longer capable of making complex financial decisions with any reliability. I became his primary caregiver alongside my mother. I was at their house 3 to 4 times a week. I managed his medical appointments, his medication schedule, his conversations with his doctors about what was coming and what we could do to slow it. Conrad came when he could, which was less often than I would have liked, but I told myself he was managing the business side, and I trusted that he was. What I didn't know was that, during this period, Conrad had been quietly working with a lawyer I had never met to restructure certain aspects of my father's estate documentation. He had power of attorney, something my father had put in place years earlier when both of us were still equally trusted with everything, and he had used it in ways that were not discussed with me and were not disclosed to my mother and were not, I would later discover, entirely consistent with what my father had expressed as his intentions during the period when he was still capable of expressing them clearly. I don't know how much my father understood of what was happening by the time the documents were changed. That is the question I will carry with me for the rest of my life and never fully answer. He died on a Monday in October. We held the service on Friday. It was a quiet funeral, the way he would have wanted, and I held my mother's hand through all of it and thought mostly about the 35 years of work that had filled that room with the people who showed up to say goodbye. On the following Thursday, while I was at my mother's house helping her sort through paperwork and trying to make sense of the first week of her life without him, Conrad transferred the estate funds. I found out 4 days later from a bank statement in a plain white envelope. I called Conrad immediately. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me, and then he explained, calmly, in the tone of someone who had rehearsed this, that the estate had been restructured in the final months of our father's illness to reflect what he described as a more accurate picture of each person's contribution to the business. He said there was documentation. He said it had all been done properly. He said he was sorry I was upset. He said he was sorry I was upset. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not that he was sorry for what he had done. Not that he regretted it. Not that he wished it had gone differently. He was sorry that I was upset. As if my upset was the problem. As if the problem were emotional rather than financial, personal rather than legal, something that therapy might address rather than a court. I hung up the phone. I sat in my mother's kitchen for a long time. And then I did the thing that I should have done the moment I found out, which was to call a lawyer. Not a family friend. Not someone who knew Conrad. A lawyer I had found myself, recommended by a business contact I trusted, someone who had no existing relationship with anyone in my family and therefore no reason to soften anything they told me. What she told me was not simple, and it was not fast, and it was not cheap. But it was clear. The restructuring Conrad had done was not airtight. There were questions about the conditions under which my father had signed certain documents. There were questions about the timeline, about what my father had been capable of understanding at the point the changes were made, about the role of the attorney Conrad had used, and whether adequate independent counsel had been present. There were questions that, in her professional opinion, a court would want answered. I filed. I want to be honest about what the next 18 months looked like, because this story would be incomplete if I let you believe that what followed was clean or swift or anything other than one of the hardest sustained periods of my adult life. My mother was grieving. Conrad stopped speaking to me almost immediately after I filed. The extended family divided in the way extended families divide when money and grief are involved simultaneously. Along lines you couldn't have predicted beforehand, and that have not fully healed since. I kept working. I had spent 12 years building the operational knowledge of that business, and whatever else was true, I understood those 37 trucks and 4 states better than anyone alive, including Conrad. I reached out to several of the company's longest-standing clients directly, not to damage anything, but to maintain relationships that I had personally built, and that were, in several cases, relationships with me rather than with the company as an entity. 3 of those clients followed me when I started consulting independently. Within 6 months, I had enough of a foundation to register my own logistics consulting firm. Within a year, I had 7 clients. Within 18 months, I had 12, including 2 that had previously been clients of my father's company under Conrad's management and had not been satisfied with how things had changed. The legal process concluded in the 22nd month after I filed. The settlement was not everything I should have received. These things rarely are. But it was substantially more than 0, which is what Conrad had intended me to have, and it included a formal acknowledgement of certain irregularities in the estate process that I will not describe in detail here, but that meant something to me beyond the financial number. I used part of the settlement to pay my legal fees. I used the rest to expand the consulting firm. I hired 2 people. I moved into a proper office space. I named the firm after the road my father's first warehouse had been on, because I wanted to carry something of his forward that Conrad couldn't restructure or transfer or sign away in a document while I wasn't looking. Conrad and I have not spoken since the settlement was reached. I don't know if we ever will. I have thought about what I would say to him if the opportunity came, and I have not been able to find a version of it that doesn't collapse into something I don't want to be. So I have left it where it is. What I think about instead is my father. The 35 years of work. The 37 trucks. The clients who showed up at his funeral and stood in the back because they hadn't been sure they were welcome, and I had to go find them and bring them in because they had known him for 20 years, and they deserved to be there. He built something real. It was supposed to be for both of us. Conrad made a decision about that, and I made a different decision in response. And both of those decisions have consequences that neither of us is finished living with yet. What I know is this. I built something of my own now. On ground that nobody restructured while I wasn't looking. With clients who are here because of the work, not because of a name on a document. My father would have understood that. I have to believe he would have understood that. If someone in your family has ever taken something that was supposed to be shared, tell me about it below. I read every comment. I want to hear it.